Good day and welcome to the Frontline Chatter podcast. I am your host, Jarian Gibson, and I am back today with Sean Massey and Stephen Wagner again. And we are going to talk about a fun subject that kind of impacts us all and also has helped us grow in our careers. But before we get to that, how you doing today, Sean?
I'm doing good, Jarian. It's kind of cold here in Wisconsin as we record this. How are you doing?
Same. It's cold here as well. No school for the kids today. We are negatives with the wind chill. My office is warm, but there are some cold spots, so I have a heater up here to go along with my mini split. But I guess we shouldn't complain because Steven over there in Canada probably gets it much worse than us. So how you doing today, Steven?
Cold, but I'm hanging in there. I've been on this work blitz for about a month and a half, so thankfully I've just been huddled in my apartment here, the heat cranked, and might jump on a plane and go somewhere a little bit warm when I get the opportunity. So just hanging in there.
Yeah, warmer climate does sound good, but the nice thing here is the cold here is only through the weekend or till Saturday. I think we're going to start warming up and be 55 on Monday. So this is kind of a quick little turnaround here for us. It's funny because it started off nice on the weekend, last weekend, and then Sunday night you could feel the cold come in, and then Monday and then Tuesday night it get really bad, and then today. So yeah, it's kind of that quick turnaround, that little sandwich of cold between two warm weeks of bread. Yeah. But yeah, today's conversation, we're going to talk about home labs. So go ahead and kick us off, Steven.
Yeah, so we all know how important home labs are, whether it's for fun or for work. Whether we want to test new technology, setting up a test deployment for something we're doing for work, or learning something new to advance our career. Home labs can cost a lot. They can cost very little. They can be very large and include racks full of servers, SAN, storage units, and networking equipment. But at the same time, they can also be super small, nimble, very efficient, both on the wallet and on the power bill. A home lab is what you make of it. It's your lab. It's a place to learn. It's a place to have fun. And, with this podcast, we're hoping to jump into the topic of home labs and talk about experiences, costs, what we're running, and more.
Yeah. And also, too, after this podcast, we're going to have a follow-up webinar, which not really a webinar, but it's going to be an open community chat as well. So this podcast is going to set the stage for that conversation that we're going to have today. And then to get others thinking about, what they want to talk about and bring in as far as relates to their home lab. So we have a list of topics here. Before we get into that, any thoughts before we go, Sean?
No, I'm just looking forward to this conversation and the open conversation we're going to have with the community about home labs, because as you guys have both said, this is a very important thing for many of us in the field. And, we all have a lot to share, lessons that we've learned. And I think this is kind of the kickoff to that bigger conversation.
So let's jump right in. But the first thing is what is our purpose, right? Why? The question of why, why do we want to do this? What projects and what use cases that we're going to look at. So let's start with Steven on this one.
Oh, I've got a lot to say. Let me know when my time runs out. So for me,
I need a buzz there. I'm just kidding.
The projects and use cases, like when I was 19, I started my own company, and I needed a lab to pretty much test, teach, educate myself. Everything that I was doing for customers, I needed to figure out how to do it. And I was young back then. So, we're talking the most basic stuff, VLANs. We're talking, I remember loading up VMware Server. So back in the old days, before ESXi, when there was ESX, GSX, and VMware Server that ran on Linux, I wanted to learn how to virtualize. I wanted to learn how to do storage. I was doing cool stuff with Leo Target before they implemented it into the Linux kernel. I was curious what could be done. And so this started a huge exploration into the home lab territory. Fast forward to today, now I have a VDI deployment. So I've got a full Horizon stack with app volumes, SQL servers, Active Directory, Entra ID. And so the use cases in my eyes were endless. And so I'm still using it to educate myself, still using it to do test deployments. I'm going to stop myself from going on too much about this and hand it over to Sean.
Wait, you don't want the...
Look, because that didn't have to be used.
Well, you know, oh, we're gonna have to, you know, edit this a little bit, or just keep this in.
Nah,
it's fun.
we're keeping it. It's a fun conversation.
All right. So, you know, I've had a home lab now for probably close to 25 years in some respects. And like mine started for the same reasons that Stevens did, which was, how do I learn new things? And I started mine in college, right? I was going to school in an IT program for a 4-year degree. And yeah, we had some hands-on time in the classroom, but you know, that's very limited on what you can learn and what you can do. And I wanted to know more, right? It's like you get that first taste of doing something with Windows Server, and you know there's so much more under the covers, but it's like you don't have time in class for it. So mine started with taking my old desktop and an old laptop that I had and just trying new things with it, like putting Windows Server 2020 or 23 or 2003. Wow. Putting Windows Server 2003 on it, setting up file shares, you know, building an Active Directory, putting Linux on a machine just to get the hang of it. And it kind of grew from there. And as time went on, it kind of scaled out. And as my journey through IT changed, my lab changed with it, from just being something I could use to learn to being something that I use to create content, to now morphing into something that's not only a learning environment for me, but also as something I can use to self-host services and replace expensive cloud services, and use it for, you know, use it to save money in some respects, save money in theory on ongoing services that, you know, I'd have to pay a ton of money for, but that now I can, you know, turn around and give to my family, like hosting Minecraft servers, which is also probably one of the biggest use cases in my lab these days.
I'm surprised I haven't gotten to that point yet, because my kids do Minecraft. They play Roblox, the other stuff. Mm-hmm. You know, they have a lockdown Discord, which I'm thinking about hosting like a Discord style that for them instead. But yeah, mine started similar as well. As a teenager, I kind of, even before a teenager, I think even younger, was more of learning how computers work. So building my own computer, sourcing the parts, that kind of stuff. It started there, and then just loading, probably gonna show my age here, like DOS and Windows 3.1 and that kind of stuff. And then learning some basic programming stuff. And then I kind of got into like some side jobs of networking. So I was helping some libraries and schools out with Apple networking setup and that kind of stuff. So going into that phase, and then in my late teens, early 20s, I got into a role where I was doing tech support, but I had an opportunity to replace a solution with in-user computing to kind of help solve a problem where they were coming in through dial-up and VPN and so forth. So then I started playing with Windows 2000 and Active Directory and, you know, MetaFrame 1.8, Tarantella, a couple other solutions back in the day. And then from there, just evolving as my career evolved. For the most part, I've kept a pretty big home lab over the years, especially when I was independent, even when I was in consulting. The last couple of years, though, in my current role, though, I mostly use the internal lab resources because they're a lot more powerful. And for the stuff that I do, it does that. But I'm probably going to spin back up a smaller lab just for, I'm playing with starting to learn a little bit of development stuff too. So, you know, that probably will do a smaller lab for that. So Yeah, so kind of similar paths here, similar use cases. You're over there smiling, Steven. Sonny, you got something to say?
I was just about to say, it's not about the size of the home lab; it's about how you use it.
That's true. And I still have a rack here in my office, like right over here to my right. It's mostly powered off. The only things that are powered on in that room are pretty much my networking equipment for my office right now. But the servers are pretty much been powered off for a while. So we kind of got projects in use cases. I think, to kind of wrap that up, the biggest thing is, more of learning, curiosity, maybe doing things outside of your current role, or things inside your current role where you might not have the resources or the time during the day as you're working, with internal customers or external customers, to be able to get that hands on. And maybe you're doing that in the evenings, like some of us do, or on the weekends, or just whenever you have free time in between things.
Yeah, and one thing to add to this too, before we kind of go into the rest of this conversation, is whenever you're thinking about building a lab, I think all three of us kind of just fell into it, right? Like, we didn't necessarily all approach it with a purpose of this is what we want to do when we started it. It was kind of, oh, this is neat. I need to learn something and I want to have something quick to do it. Today, it's easier to get hardware and software and all the stuff that, you may not think of when you want to get into labbing. So as we talk about like history and projects that we've done with it, one thing to keep in mind for yourself is, what do I want to do with it, right? Approach building a lab, or if you have a small lab, expanding it, or, growing it or replacing stuff, approach that with a purpose, right? Think about what you want to do with your lab going forward, what you need to do, or what you need to achieve that, and then use that to kind of build a plan. You're going to hear us talk about things like spouse acceptance factor. As you go through this, right? Labs are an investment, like anything else in your career, right? There's an investment. There's an investment of time. There's an investment of money. There's an investment of space somewhere to do it, and possibly trade-offs that go with that. And those are things you have to really think about as you go into it. And, you don't want to be going back to your spouse or your family going, hey, I need to buy 2 more servers to do this. And, I have to buy more hard drives and RAM or whatever, and kind of nickel and dime this. Right? You want to think about what you need and plan for it appropriately.
Yeah. Also understand, what kind of budget do you have as well, as I think is the big thing. It's like, do I have a budget to go out and get everything I want? Can I look for deals out there? Can I look where companies are possibly retiring hardware where I might be able to get a good deal, or just, have the hardware outright in general? I'll go ahead, Steven.
I was also going to say that if you do it all at once, not only can you help with the spouse acceptance factor, but you can also avoid having to turn on EBC mode in your cluster.
Yes. Or you have to plan very carefully when you go to expand.
Yeah.
All lessons that we've learned. And, sorry, I don't want to derail this part anymore, because actually, no, this is a good transition into the next thing we were going to talk about, which was location and considerations. Number one of them being spouse acceptance factor, right? But to kind of build off that, right? Because this kind of goes hand in hand with it, is, we talk about locations. Are we just doing this at home? Are we hosting this somewhere in our house or somewhere on our property? Are you getting a colo? Are you going to just try to run everything in the public cloud? And all of those have trade-offs. So I run, Jari, and you mentioned yours is in the room next to you, and you have kind of a shed quarters set up where it's at home, but it's not in your main house, right?
It is now. Previously, it was my basement. But as the kids have gotten older, and they've taken over the basement, or my basement is mostly video games and Legos now, it did move up to here. So it's actually in its own little room, where you can't hear it. It's kind of sectioned off, got a door, and it's got its own mini split too when I first built it. So it's cool. It's that kind of stuff. You can't hear it in here. But yeah, for the first couple of years here in my house, I was in the basement with it.
Yeah. Whereas mine isn't, is in my basement with me. So I have a basement office, and it's got a door behind it, right? It's under the stairs to my basement. There's a wall and a door, but mine isn't cooled. I don't have air conditioning in my house. So in the winter, well, right now it's 68 degrees in there because it's like it's 13 degrees outside right now. So it's, great natural cooling. But in the summer, there's times I've had to turn things off because it gets to 100 degrees in there. And while I have, the person who built this house decided they wanted to heat the garage. So there's a duct that runs through here to the garage. I have a fan and stuff in there to kind of dump heat into the garage. But in the summer, it doesn't work very well. In the winter, it works great. So that's one consideration, right? Where you're going to run it. But then the other noise, obviously, right? Depending on what you use for hardware, there's noise. You might want to buy a rack. Again, going back to spouse acceptance factor, anything that arrives on a pallet, you should get approval for. Yes, I have done that. Lessons learned from our mistakes. And then power, right? Do you have power in that location? Do you have to run circuits? Do you have enough room on your breaker box to install those circuits? Who's going to install it, right? Those are all things that you have to consider. Now, the other side of that is you may save money having it at home for those trade-offs, but if you want to go to the cloud, well, now you have an ongoing expense. There are people who do their labs entirely in the cloud. There's people who have their labs in colos, and they just justify it as a self-improvement expense or as a learning expense.
Or
Steven,
if they're independent, a business expense.
Yep.
So I'm going to save the hardware discussion for later on when we jump into that, but I'm going to keep it short. So for example, with me, I guess you could say I take a more hybrid approach. So I have a workload sitting on Azure, which is connected to my main on-prem network, which then has another site-to-site connection to my condo server. So, 3 different areas. And with everything that we've talked about here too, one thing that I want to point out is safety is a big thing, especially if you have a family in the house. I've had dedicated rooms to lots of server equipment that have been air conditioned properly. And have had a situation where a power cord on an air conditioner ended up sparking and almost starting a fire. The only reason why I found out about it is because I started getting notifications from HPE ILO telling me that the temperature's gone through the roof, making me go to the room to find out that there were sparks shooting off of the plug-in for the air conditioner. So this is all very important stuff, and these are considerations that you have to take into when you design and deploy your home lab.
Mm-hmm.
I was laughing earlier when Sean Smith mentioned the pallet thing, because there was that one time where when I was in the basement, Shane Kleiner and I were doing a session for Briveform, and we were doing all this testing of different monitoring solutions. It was part of our EUC bake-off thing we did years ago. And somehow, I think this is when Shane and I were at Choice, or I was independent, he was still there. I can't remember around the timing of that. But he somehow got Nutanix to send us a whole rack of servers. Right. So we had probably about, I think, 8 or 12 nodes. So, and that was the 2U 4-node model. So basically, I think we had like 12 nodes of that to test with that. And I had like a 24U cluster or 24U rack. And so it showed up in a pallet, and I was like, what the heck are you two doing? What's going on here? So the whole thing with the pallet showing up and the wife acceptance factor and so forth is a big thing. Bowser or whatever. So yeah, but the big thing I like you talked about is power too, because in my basement I did have to add I had enough room in my breaker box to add dedicated circuits. When I built my office up here, I actually planned out to have 2 separate circuits extra for the rack for the two power supply units for it. So all the things that come into consideration, especially if you're gonna go bigger. Now if you're gonna go smaller and use things like the Nux, or I know like the Xeon D were popular for a couple of years, or different things like that. I'm not getting too much on hardware, but depends on the size and the scale. You might be okay with this normal power. But as you scale up, you definitely want to look at your power requirements, your cooling requirements, making sure you're able to facilitate that and understand what the impact is going to be to your utility bill as well.
Yep. Yeah. And one other thing to keep in mind about power, right? You can mostly run your own electrical circuits, but you have to understand like wiring types, like what gauge of wire are you running, and does that match up with the breaker you're putting in? And does it match up with the outlets that you're installing in your room? Right? There's a whole bunch of stuff around electrical code that you kind of have to keep in mind. So like if you're running a 20 amp circuit for your lab, right, you have to put in 20 amp outlets. You have to use I believe it's the yellow sheath on the wire, right? And you want, make sure it's grounded properly and all those things, right? So you may want to consider an electrician if this is something you're not comfortable doing to get it done right. Because like Steven said, right, you don't want to have like a fire that comes out of this.
And just as a disclaimer, we're not telling you to do anything.
No,
what we're telling you to do is consult a professional if you need to modify any of the powering wiring inside of your household.
Yes, definitely consult a professional, right? Like especially if you're not comfortable with any of this. But then there's also right, to Jarian's point about equipment, right? And power usage, right? There's UPSs you can buy, you can get used that would be great for a home lab, except they have some, high amperage plug on them, right? Twist lock plugs or weird looking prongs on them that are 30 amp or 50 amp plugs that are things you're not going to run yourself, right? But you have to keep that in mind when you're looking at equipment, especially used equipment. So I think this is a good point to transition into hardware.
Actually,
and
one more thing before we do that real quick. Stephen had a good point too about his hybrid. So I know internet today is pretty much, the standard. Everyone's getting high speed, but you don't always have the option of high speed everywhere. There are still places who don't have, like I'm fortunate here where when Google rolled out fiber, I think we were like the first city to get Google Fiber, and it started here before they went around. So I have Google Fiber plus another backup one since I work 100% from home now. But making sure that if you're going to have any kind of hybrid lab, that you have proper connectivity. If you're going to do any kind of remote access into it, does your ISP allow any of that kind of stuff coming into your environment? Can you get static IPs? Do you have to use dynamic DNS? Those type of things too are other considerations, whether you're going to do it at home or on-prem. At home, in the cloud, or in a hybrid model like Steven does. I just wanted to throw that out there before we move on to hardware.
Yeah, that's one thing we didn't talk about is internet connectivity and all that goes with that. And there are still a lot of places, especially in the US, where high speed isn't high speed, or it's high speed relative to that area. So yeah, another good consideration is, what's your internet connection?
Like, I think they just launched like 10 gig or 25 gig you can get here now, or it's like 8, 10, or 25 or something they just did. I have 2.5 as my primary, but yeah, they're getting to where you can actually get it. It's not that expensive either. I can actually look it up while we talk about hardware. I'll look it up real quick. But yeah, I think the next step would be hardware. Who wants to kick that one off?
So Steven, why don't you take us through hardware and, kick this off?
So when it comes to hardware, I do want to share the details of my lab, but I want to start this particular subtopic off. Take advantage of what's out there. There is a lot of equipment that you can find at technology recycling companies. You can go on eBay. And the one really nice heartwarming thing about this is that these servers some of them have such a long history. Like, you can go and pick up a server for your home lab, whether it's like a DL360 or something like that. It's got some history. It was doing financial transactions for a bank or doing something for a large organization. And now it can become part of your home lab. And it's nice because by purchasing used equipment, you avoid the stuff getting thrown into a landfill or from becoming e-waste, which is a problem that is plaguing all of us. It's something that we should be very aware of. But it's nice that you can find all this different hardware that you can bring into your lab. It's great too, because you actually get to play with the hardware that large organizations are using. You get to play with hardware that you're potentially going to be deploying when you learn this technology, if you're purchasing it for learning. Now with me, with my case is a little bit different, because I actually, I need to have a lab with current equipment. So quite a bit of my stuff I've purchased new, but I've been using it for a long time. So with my main on-prem home lab, I've got a couple old HPE DL360P Gen 8s, dual processors each. I think each has 10 cores. In one of the servers, I've got an NVIDIA A2. The other server, I've got an L4. It's kind of interesting. I had to go into a secret engineering menu to enable the 64-bit memory space for it. I think I'm creeping up to just under a terabyte of RAM. I've got UPSs. I used to have a HPE MSA SAN, but I decommed it because Synology has been pretty nice to me and has been hooking me up with some gear. So I've got a Synology device that I'm using with dual 10 gig. I've got 10 gig switching, redundant 10 gig switching, using Unify for that.
So
I'm go for it.
Before you finish, Stephen, I just want to throw in a little disclaimer of, right, we mentioned we've been doing this for a long time. Yeah. If you are new to home labbing, don't feel you have to jump into the deep end right away. This is stuff that gets built up over time. And going back to what we said at the beginning, think about what you want to do and build to that, and then build up. Sorry, Stephen, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I wanted to get that piece in as you started talking about, like redundancy and SANs and things like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. When I first started this, when I was 19 and started actually investing, I just picked up an ML350 and I got some Cisco switch to turn on VLANs. And I was running 4 or 5 virtual machines, and that was great for like 6-7 years. And then I incorporated it into future lab designs. So start off basic, start off with one server, pick up a NUC, and then over a period of time, you can invest a crazy amount of money, that might potentially result in a divorce, and go into the deep end, pick up all the servers, deploy your Azure lab, connect it with the site to site. Like here at my condo, I've got another HPE ML server. I'm not sponsored by HPE, just by the way. With another Synology unit, I've got some Ubiquiti 10 gig switch at my foot, and I've got that site to site to where all my main on-prem gear is. And so it racks up quite a power bill. Some utility companies report power usage to the authorities. Thankfully, I've never had any surprise visits due to my power usage.
Oh yeah, you're growing something over there.
Yeah, but it's great, because this is a perfect learning lab where I can learn, I can deploy test environments, and I'm going to stop talking now and hand it over to someone else to share.
Well, I want to do a follow-up too. So I can get 1, 2, 5, or 8 here. And so correction, I currently have 2, not 2.5, but it's $150 a month for 8 gig fiber I can get here.
That's crazy.
I'm not going to use it, I'm not going to use 5 gig. I don't think I've ever used enough to use 2 gig, but it's crazy, depending where you are, what kind of speed you can get to your house. But, with those speeds too, when it comes to hardware, you have to make sure you have the proper networking equipment. Can your networking equipment take advantage of that? Like I use Ubiquiti Networks as well, not sponsored by them, for all my networking gear. But you got to make sure that whatever router that you have, I know most of them will give you the router to come in, but are you going to use that amount of bandwidth? Does it have the features? Like I have one of the gateways where I can do, I think, up to 5 gig on it, but I do 2 gig. But then as you turn features on, that may reduce your throughput on the device, like, firewall and IDS, IPS, that kind of stuff. So you got to consider that also when it comes to your hardware. For me, and most of my stuff, I've gotten off eBay or I've gotten off recycled stuff. Most of it's Super Micro. I have a couple Dell in my rack still. I think I still have like K1 and K2 cards sitting in the boxes over there in the rack. That those things, like I said, are powered off because I don't use them anymore. But yeah, like they were saying, look for eBay, look for sales. You'll see a lot of places where there's horror liquidation, and you can get like those bulk things from eBay or even locally. I know those in the community have given stuff away or donated stuff as well, which I've been on the receiving end of that also. So look out there, make friends of the community. Even maybe you might want to team up with a couple people and have like a community-based lab. Maybe you all chip in to co-locate it somewhere, or have someone host it and chip in for the hardware and chip in for the utilities. But other ways too, where you can kind of have, a shared community lab also when it comes to the hardware or the hardware. And one more thing too, before I hand over to Sean was, if you don't have, the room or the space, or, you want to make sure that you're getting newer hardware all the time, that's where cloud might be a good place for you. Rent it for when you need to use it and then power it down. The other thing too is that some of these community programs, or even if you do like certain subscriptions to software, they might come with cloud credits that you can use also to kind of help offset those costs if you're going to look at using cloud as a location versus having your own hardware in your house. And then the last thing is that now with everything getting smaller and more powerful, it's easier to get a nice, robust lab without having to have a bunch of large gear in your house as well. And I'll hand it over to Sean.
Yeah. So those are all really good points. And I think one or two of those I want to save till we talk about software. Because you mentioned like subscription programs and cloud credits and things like that. But I'm kind of in a similar boat to Steven, right? Like I have a rack of stuff. All my stuff is old off-lease Dell hardware because I got comfortable with Dell's iDRAC interface and decided that's what I want to use going forward. So I have like couple R630s, a couple R430s. I'm trying to get out some of the old R620s that I have. I'm in the process of decommissioning some of those. I have gone a lot more. Well, I have a couple of like Synologies and QNAPs, and I have something running TrueNAS for storage, but I'm in the process of moving more towards hyperconverged. I'll talk about that more in the when we get to software. But yeah, I use a lot of old off-lease recycled gear. Some of it I got on eBay, some of it I got from like places like Tech Mike New York and other hardware refurbishers where you could kind of get like a custom built to order, which by the way is not that expensive for used and off-lease gear. So you get what you want, and it matches what else you have, to avoid things like having EVC turned on or having different, processor speeds and core counts on each host. I also use Unify for my networking stack. Here's the thing about Unify, right? Like they have good gear. It's not terribly expensive, and you get an easy to use management interface with it. And you can build a full network stack if you choose to use all their stuff, right? You can have Wi-Fi plus switching plus firewall if you choose to use it all. I don't use everything that they have. Some of my networking is completely virtualized. But right, their 10 gig switches were too good to pass up for what you got. So none of us are sponsored, by the way. Like I'm again, throw that disclaimer out there. We just all found something really good that we use. One other thing to keep in mind as you plan hardware, and that's around the drives you put in your devices, right? If you're using, Nooks or old desktops or whatever, any drive will work because it's a SATA drive. Once you start getting into the more enterprise grade gear, they get to be a little bit pickier, right? A SATA drive, a cheap 1 terabyte SATA drive, something off brand or, one of those, I don't even know what the names of the brands are, but you get them for like $50 on Amazon, right? They'll work great in a desktop. You plug it into a server, you start getting, yellow flashing lights on some of those drives. So you have to be a little bit more picky about your drives. But then that's also where eBay and hardware recyclers or hardware disposal companies come into play. You can find good deals on SAS SSDs that came out of SANS that were recycled, right? You can get them for cheap and get better capacity with it. Same for network cards and other components you might need. Just because you buy a server doesn't mean you have to, buy everything in the server at the same time. You can go out and find the card you need and add it later. So Steven, you had something you wanted to add in.
Yeah, just a couple things too, is that, have fun with the project and make sure you do your research. Like, for example, some of us might be picking up enterprise SANs and throwing them into our home lab, but there's amazing alternatives like with QNAP or Synology NASs. One common thing that I see, if we want to get into the technical nitty gritty, is that there's a lot of home labbers that will try to deploy iSCSI, for example, with Synology or QNAP. And then they start getting timeout requests and they blame the hardware that they're using. And Sean, to your point about making sure that you're using the right drives, the reason why, like, I see a lot of folks having issues with this, and it's actually just because the drives that they put inside of their NAS device are, they're hitting iSCSI timeouts on their IO requests. And so it's not actually the device that they're using, it's because they put in the wrong drives. Or if they slapped in a couple NVMe or SSD cache drives into it, they would be able to avoid hitting the iSCSI timeouts. And that's one of the reasons why enterprises use like these SANs, is because you're not going to hit those timeouts because you're using high performance disks. But when it comes to home labs, you have to just keep small stuff like this in mind, which again keeps it fun, but just make sure that you do your research.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. And, you know, especially when you get into this hardware, like you were saying, hardware compatibility list, you know, vendor recommended drives, all those things will come into factor. So make sure you look at those. And you mentioned Unified, they even have over 10 gig now. Like you can get 10 gig pretty economical, but they're even getting up there in like 25 and 100 gig now, and they're networking. And I run pretty much the whole stack here as well. I run their cameras and stuff. Also, I'm waiting to get their security stuff. Now they're getting new sensors out, coming out here. I'm going to probably throw those around my house too as well. But let's go ahead and move into software. So I'll kick that one off. Software, it depends, right? Some vendors have community programs where you get their software. Sean mentioned HCI is becoming popular in labs. You can get things like Nutanix Community Edition. I know if you're part of like the Omnissa Insiders, they probably give you guys software. I know through CTP program, we had access to software, but the CTP program and CTA program is no longer there. So it depends, you know, what you're doing. A lot of these community programs out there can help you get access to software to allow you to test it in a non-production scenario. But I know even getting trial stuff, sometimes companies will even give you trial stuff in exchange for you writing a blog or a review or honest feedback as well. So don't always think that you have to pay for software to get these labs. And there's things like subscriptions too, right? I mentioned subscriptions for getting cloud credits. Those same subscriptions can get, like MSDN, for example, can get you also access to the software too as well. Or you can also use trial software as well. You just have to keep rebuilding it, and that's where things like automation or other things come into play as you're building these labs out. And I'll hand this over to Sean for the next part of this for software.
Yeah, so let's start on that community programs and subscription piece first, right? There are programs with vendors. Some of them are, based on your involvement in the community, that will get you access to software. Others are things that you would have to pay for as a subscription. Now, this used to be a lot easier, right? I'm not going to lie about this, right? And say, oh yeah, it's great. Like, it used to be a lot easier. There used to be things like TechNet from Microsoft that, was great. You got access to servers, not just like you got Windows desktop, Windows Server, Office,
SQL.
all the stuff like SQL and Exchange and all that. The problem is a lot of those programs were ruined by people in the community who decided, I'm going to now resell some of these keys I'm not using. Right. So there were a lot of really good things that got ruined from these programs. So it's a lot harder to get licensing now. The same on like if you work a lot with VMware, right? VMUG Advantage is still around, but the biggest benefit of VMUG Advantage now requires a certification in order to get access to the license. So that's one piece of this, right? The programs that do exist, though, typically are a lot more expensive or have additional gates behind them to get licensing because companies have been burned in the past. So keep that in mind as you're looking at things, right? Like MSDN, I think it's like the lowest tier subscription that gets you access to some of the software. if it still exists, was like $600 a year, right? So keep that in mind. The flip side of that is there's a lot of free stuff out there that you can use. You can use, like I've been moving my lab to Nutanix Community Edition, which is a free version of Nutanix's product that has, some limitations like the maximum number of hosts. It's essentially the same software as the commercial Nutanix products, but they do things a little bit differently, which has also been a really fun thing to learn in order to, do some stuff in my lab. There are things like, Linux, right? You can deploy any or almost any variation of Linux in your lab for free, right? And then there's all sorts of tools around that are open source and free to use. And then even on top of that, there's a lot of open source alternatives to enterprise applications and cloud services that if you want to learn concepts and fundamentals, you can put those in. So I mentioned earlier, I self-host a lot of stuff. So I'm using things like OwnCloud to host my own OneDrive alternative or Google Drive alternative. I'm using, PFs or OPNsense is an open source firewall. There's all sorts of other self-hosted applications, Service Desk. I have a Miro alternative that I host and things like that are teaching me about, hosting my own applications and building out, those kinds of services and tying them all together with an open source identity provider. So this is a huge rabbit hole. And there's a lot that you can, once you start looking, there's a lot of stuff you can start doing with this, whether it's infrastructure software that is open source or open source applications.
Sean, you hit the nail on the head. You hit the nail on the head. What I'll do is I'll just expand into a couple of those items. So for a lot of us, especially with some of the folks in World of UC, there's quite a few consultants. And so the thing is that from my point of view as a consultant and for a lot of others, you can pick up, like for example, if you can sign up to become a Microsoft partner, you get access to the Action Pack, which is going to be discontinued soon. They now have the Cloud AI program, which gives you a whole bunch of licenses that you can use, internal use. I think depending on the tier, you even get like a Windows 365 desktop in the cloud as part of it. And then you can also partner with other companies. Like for example, like I have a partnership with Sophos, so I get I can deploy Sophos, NFRs. Mm-hmm. Some of the NFRs allow internal use, some don't, depending on the organization that you're getting it from. For example, like with VMware by Broadcom, they have NFRs. Those can't be used for internal use. They're only for demo training purposes, so keep that in mind. But there's a whole bunch of, this is just an example of how there's a whole bunch of different routes that you can take to get entitled software deployed in your home lab. And if you contribute to the community, such as blogging, making videos, you'd be surprised that companies will reach out and want you to try their hardware, try their software, and then just jumping into the open source stuff. A lot of enterprises use open source, so don't focus on a single solution or software.
Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of gets us into career development, because you don't want to, like you said, don't focus on a single solution or a single software, because that's where career development comes in, whether it's in your current role or you're looking to expand that. I know some people on the EUC side. I'll call Andrew Morgan out, who was big on the EUC side for a long time, started getting into programming, and is now on the AI side as well. So don't limit yourself to single solutions or single mindsets. Look at how you can grow within the role that you're within, or if you want to expand out to a different role. All these things come into play. And I know doing things like dev on the side, or looking at AI, or figuring out how a new use case can bring into your company or your role to help things out. All those things can help with career development. That's how I did with me starting early, was getting into end user computing. That was going from help desk into an admin role, and rolling out end user computing in a company was my first early example of career development. So kind of think about how you can use these things. What can you do? How can you branch out to learn more, but also possibly take the next step in your career development?
Yeah, I'd agree strongly with that. And we should also put a little caveat when you mention Andrew Morgan. It should be Andrew Morgan, who used to be in the EUC space and my former podcast host.
Yes. Oh, yes, he was. Yes. And before you say about that, I need to put a post on this because I just saw we were 10 years in to Frontline Chatter. So I need to post about that. So thank you. Yes, he was the original co-host with me. Like we started this together just over 10 years ago here now. So.
Yeah, and it's hard to believe it's been 10 years. But you know, back onto the point about career development, right? Once I got out of college and started getting traction in my career, right, my lab was huge for that because again, there were things I wanted to learn that I wasn't going to learn at work, that were relevant to my job. But then the other interesting thing that happened is I started writing about things, right? I started blogging, and my lab kind of became that sandbox to develop content for my blog. So I had in the way you ended up in EUC, Jarian, right? Like I got hired at a place that was doing it wasn't Horizon at the time. It was VMware View. It was a VMware View deployment. Never touched the stuff. And the contractor that they had hired to deploy it all got bought and most of their people left. So I had to kind of learn how to do this. So having a home lab, building out a vSphere environment, helped with that. But then it also got me blogging even more because nobody at the time had really written about it. So now it's on to developing content and using the lab to generate that. And the really interesting thing, and I think you'll find amongst all of us here on the recording, is the minute we went from just using our home lab to sharing what we knew, whether it was through writing or presentations or podcasts, our career started to change significantly. Having that out there made it easier for us to apply for jobs and go, oh, you want to see what I can do? Here, look at my blog. Right? Oh, you're really interested in learning about this. Well, come see my presentation at this VMUG meeting or this CUCG meeting or this conference, right? So
or
it
World of
opens
EUC.
Doors. Yeah, EUC World, Amplify. Not too late. It opens doors for you to be able to create content. Whether it's somebody seeing your blog and wanting to talk to you about an opportunity, even if it's just to develop more content, like Steven said, or it opens actual doors through connections in the community to getting jobs, right? It's something that if you're going to build a lab, as long as your employer doesn't prohibit it, find a way to share what you know. And it's getting easier to do that as time goes on. Back in 2010 is when I started my blog, right? It was forums and blogs. And I think that even kind of predated Twitter a little bit.
Yep.
Now it's all sorts of social media, podcasting, blogging, YouTube, and other video sites, hosting your own webinars. You can do all these things and share what you know. And once you start sharing what you know, the easier it becomes to make connections. The way I like to put this is, people always say it's not what you know, it's who you know. But people won't do things for you if they didn't think you knew what you were doing. So it's both. All right. So Steven?
Geez, career development. I don't know, 18 years ago, deploying VMware for the first time in my home lab, learning how VLANs worked, learning how vSwitches worked, fast forward to ESXi and vCenter, we're talking distributed switches, all of that I learned how to do in my home lab, which led to creating blog posts, which led to business development, customers for my business. Fast forward, 10 years ago, how did I get into VDI? I was at a point where I needed to learn a new piece of technology. I was wondering what's next. And I put in a request for an NFR for, at the time, VMware Horizon, downloaded it, and I disappeared for 4 weeks into my home lab. And I learned everything. I learned what VDI is, persistent, non-persistent, instant clones. I learned application deployment, and I blogged about everything that I was learning. And then once I learned it, it wasn't enough. I needed to learn how to break it, which led to more blog posts, which led to career development opportunities, business opportunities. And here I am today, where I'm in the VDI trenches nonstop, doing amazing, cool projects, doing things with GPUs, the conversations leading on to AI, and all of this it started off with the Home Lab.
Mm-hmm.
And then one thing too, you mentioned about as far as learning and doing things too, a lot of us, either at one time or currently are consultants, whether we're independent or whether we were working for a solution provider. But in those roles, you're a jack of all trades, right? You'd be working on Citrix today, Omnissa tomorrow, Parallels the next day. So, having those labs kind of helps you, because you never want to go into a project blind, right? You never want to go in there and kind of, that Leroy Jenkins mentality where you're just going to go without planning. You kind of want to make sure that you understand what you're doing, can be able to install it, and not, waste your time or waste the customer's time, to make sure that you're meeting those expectations and have that knowledge. Because as you go into those customers, they expect you to have that knowledge to answer questions, to be a guiding hand for them. So that's where that career development comes in as well, is because you have to understand that. And then, just by blogging and forums and that kind of stuff, that community aspect, a lot of us have become friends with the community, whether it's been at events or writing blogs or forums or that kind of stuff. That's how we've all kind of come around and got to know each other with those avenues. So it's not just only career development, but it's also making those connections that can also help your career development, or just be a friend or a voice or someone to mentor or that kind of thing as well. So those also come into mind. Stephen, you have something else you wanted to add?
And on the topic of mentorship, it's not just about established professionals focusing on career development, but it's also about getting youth into getting excited about technology. Whether, like Sean, your example about having a laptop and starting off with a laptop as a home lab, you can deploy a hypervisor on a laptop. And so if you have someone that's in high school or even younger, like I was doing some crazy stuff when I was like 13 years old, if you empower people with a lab and their own place, something that they can call their own environment, and just let them play, amazing things will happen. Like the possibilities are endless. They'll learn, they'll get excited, they'll share. Sean?
Yeah, that's a great point. One other thing I wanted to point out too, since we're talking about, sharing with the community, right? There was a time when there weren't very many voices on certain topics when it came to blogging about technology. Nowadays, there's a lot, but that shouldn't stop you from writing your own perspective, right? You're getting into your lab, you're doing something, you're doing your use case. Maybe you're doing something a little bit unique or novel with what you're doing. Maybe you're following somebody else's guide and you come across something you've never seen before. Write about it anyway, right? It doesn't matter if somebody else has covered it, right? Stephen mentioned, he was blogging about what he was learning when he was trying to learn Horizon. Well, there have been people who've written about it. I've written about doing a 0 to end Horizon deployment. Carl Stahlhood has. The vendor has their own,
Tech Zone
deep documentation on it outside of the regular documentation, right? Doesn't stop anybody from writing their perspective and how they did it and how they approached the problem, because there's always something you can learn when you share what you know.
Yeah.
So we kind of already transitioned into where lab meets the community. Are there any other thoughts on that? Because I feel like we kind of covered that by the last couple part of the conversation. So was there anything else you guys wanted to add about where lab meets the community?
No, I think we're good.
Yeah, just reiterating the fact that get involved in as many community programs as you can. it'll enable you from a knowledge perspective as well as potentially a licensing perspective.
Yeah. And speaking of licensing, we kind of already talked about that as far as getting access to things, whether it's through community programs, whether it's through any subscription type services, whether it's just reaching out or writing about it to where they reach out to you to get your perspective. Did you guys have any other thoughts on licensing as far as home labs?
Yeah. So the one thing I'll add is don't write off open source stuff. There is a lot of really good open source alternatives out there. And I'm not just talking about like Linux and Postgres SQL. If there's something you want to do, there's a chance that somebody else got tired of paying somebody for it and wrote their own thing. And that's a good way to go if you just want to learn concepts, right? You depending on what you're doing, you may or may not need like Windows or Microsoft SQL Server. But if you don't have a hard requirement for it, don't let that stop you, because using an open source solution, even if it's just Linux, is going to, help round out your skill set and teach you a lot more and help you approach problems from a different perspective. Even if it's only getting comfortable with a command line.
Steven, any more thoughts on licensing?
Just for those who might be listening, it might be worthwhile to list off a couple programs that we're all aware of. Like, for example, with vMug Advantage and the vExpert program right now, if you get, I believe it's VVF VCP, you get vSphere Standard. And if you get VCP VVF certified, you get access to VCF lab licenses. Sean, I think you mentioned Nutanix Community Edition.
Yeah, yep. Nutanix Community Edition, which is available. There's a forum out on the Nutanix.next community site where you have to register to get access to it. But it's basically, I'm going to step a little bit on Jarian's toes here because he works for Nutanix, but it's basically full-fledged Nutanix with some limitations on it. And unlike full-fledged Nutanix, it doesn't pass through the storage controller because it's designed to run on anything or even nested. I'm trying to think if there are a ton of other programs out there. And another thing too, cloud free tier, right? Microsoft has a free tier for Azure. Amazon has a free tier for AWS. There's a free tier for Google Cloud, a free tier for Oracle Cloud, right? Take advantage of those as well.
Veeam has a community edition. I believe you get 20 licenses with your community edition, no support.
There's two actual. There's a 10 license community edition, and then there is a 20 license edition for certified professionals. So if you have like a VCP or an MCSE or MCI, whatever Microsoft's is, right? You can get a more advanced license. And then other backup vendors also have free editions or community editions as well.
Yeah. Synology units have active backup for business. You pick up an appliance, you've got access to that. Are we missing any other big ones that?
Well, on that topic of like Synology and QNAP, they have a lot of functionality built into those devices for free.
Yeah.
So if you are looking to invest in something for your lab, that is something to definitely take a look at in terms of what you get out of the box, because there is a ton of functionality you can take advantage of.
Yeah.
And then we kind of mentioned community programs a little bit. Do you want to go any more about vendor community programs, or if we feel we cover that pretty well?
I think the only thing I would reiterate with vendor community programs is oftentimes it really depends on the vendor. Sometimes they have requirements to be invited into those programs, or you have to apply for them to be considered. Look into them, right? If there's technology that interests you, look into that program, find out what it takes, and work towards it. The worst they can say is no.
And a lot of these the vendors, especially in the EUC space, have some kind of of software or some way that you can, use their software pretty easily as well. They want you to test it out. They want the feedback. They want people writing about it. So they see it as, kind of if more people are talking about it, they're giving us feedback. It's not only helping us get the word out, but it's also helping us improve our product as well. So if you don't see anything out there on their site, don't be shy to reach out to someone or someone you see posting. If you're in the world of EUC Slack as well, we have many channels in there for the different EUC vendors. Feel free to ask in there also, because a lot of those vendors are in those channels also, and they're either helping or they're putting information out there as well. Something you wanted to add, Sean?
Yeah, and so you mentioned World of EUC. There's one World of EUC sponsor in particular I want to highlight. Now, there's 3 that are really good about this. iGel has a free 1 license copy of their solution. Tenzig has a free 1 license copy of their solution. But kind of the gold standard in the EUC space is Liquidware. They have a 5 license community edition of their command control product, which, as an IT person, you're eventually going to get called on to provide support for a family member. This is a 5 license SaaS version of their product for monitoring and remote support. Put it on your parents' PC or your kid's PC, and then when they have problems, you have a tool already, up to 5 users to be able to help them. So, and that one is, 5 users free for anyone in the community. So definitely worth checking out. It's called Liquidware Command Control.
It's really nice how, out of all the different, I guess you could say, subcategories of or fields inside of information technology, that the VDI and EUC community is the most open as far as knowledge sharing and also licensing programs for the community, because this isn't something that you see in other subfields.
So as we kind of wrap things up and wind things down here, we are going to have an upcoming, it's not really a webinar, it's going to be more of like an open dialogue session to have the next evolution of this chat about home labs and this on this topic. So this podcast is kind of serving as kind of like a way to think about it, kind of help you kind of get the conversation, help us get the conversation started. So look forward to the dates of that upcoming session. Bring your thoughts and ideas, because everyone's got different ways they approach the home lab and so forth. So we're looking forward to that. Before we close things down, any additional thoughts, Sean?
Well, have fun with this, right? If you're thinking about having a home lab, have fun with it. I had another thought and I completely lost it a second ago, and I'll probably remember it as soon as we wrap up.
Steven?
Just, again, have fun with your home lab. There's no right or wrong way to do it. Don't judge others on their home labs. Just listen to what's happening and use it when you build your own. And with the general meet that we're going to have coming up at the home lab, save some questions. If you have any questions about your home lab, feel free to bring it up when we schedule the open dialogue and the discussion. If you want to share your home lab photos, bring it all.
Also, any of our sponsors or other EUC vendors out there, please feel free to join as well. You can provide any kind of stuff for people getting access to software for their home lab. So we're always welcome to anyone to have that dialogue with. Sean, do you remember what you forgot? Or are we good? Okay.
Nope.
Well, thank you all for listening to the Frontline Chatter podcast, brought to you by the World of EUC. Not World of EUC, EUC World Amplify registration is open. Call for papers is closed. We are working through the call for papers to announce those speakers slots here pretty soon. But make sure, if you plan on attending, the sooner you attend, the better price you get for the attendance. It will be in August in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And we're going to have a little bit more time this year based on the feedback last year. So look forward to that. All the information is on worldofeuc.org. And for myself and Sean and Steven, thank you for listening to the Frontline Chatter podcast, and we'll talk to you next time.
Right.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.